From defensive tactics to the military revolution in drone warfare, the fight in Ukraine has no shortage of lessons to teach. Russia and Ukraine have been aggressively learning those lessons, lost in a constant battle of innovation, a duel of adaptation and counter-adaptation. What hasn't always been clear, though, is how effectively other militaries around the world are managing to do the same. And when you have Russian drones landing in Poland, demonstrating pretty definitively that technology and innovation that starts in Ukraine doesn't necessarily stay in Ukraine, you could argue that for NATO and other military powers around the world, keeping up is an imperative, not an optional extra. A few weeks ago, I had a chance to go to a NATO event in Istanbul to meet some of the senior NATO and Ukrainian officers and officials trying to make sure that happens. Whether that means getting Ukrainian officers to bring their experience to bear in NATO war games, or working together to develop solutions to emerging technological problems, like fiber-optic drones or glide bombs. And so today, in a follow-up to last week's episode on NATO's cross-domain command wargame, I'm going to turn my attention to the other half of that event, focused on tech, innovation, and what NATO is learning from the war in Ukraine. I'll start with a quick look at how historically countries have tried to learn lessons from a conflict they're not directly fighting in, and compare that to the way NATO's been approaching the process since February 2022. Then we'll pivot to the technological, looking at the innovation challenges that sought better solutions to fiber-optic FPVs and glide bombs and some of the technology that came out of that, before closing out with some big-picture observations that came out of my interviews and time at the event. Before we jump into it, though, let me welcome back a returning sponsor. In a time where world-shaping events can feel like a daily occurrence, there can be a real premium on making sure that when you're seeing news coverage of those events, that you're getting multiple relevant angles. If you looked at the coverage ahead of the Trump-Zelensky meeting, for example, this one would have given you the basics, that the meeting was happening. But others elevated different context, like this one, noting both that meeting will follow on the back of a Trump phone call with Putin, and the expectation that Ukraine will be requesting supplies of Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States. The tool being used to flick between headlines here is long-term channel sponsor Ground News. By reportedly drawing on more than 50,000 news sources around the world, what it can allow you to do is quickly compare headlines, while also providing you some context for the organisations covering them. Think things like ownership information. Beyond that, Ground News can also help you get more awareness and control over how algorithms might control what news you see. For example, the blind spot feed might help to surface stories that don't receive a huge amount of coverage in the sources you normally look at, while the For You feed gives you the option to focus on the kind of topics and events that you're interested in. So you can potentially focus more of your time and energy on getting a fuller understanding of the topics that interest you, rather than having to wait and filter through the stuff you don't really care about first. As I've said in the past, some of those major challenges of the modern information environment, from echo chambers to the influence of algorithms, are not the kind of things that any single tool is going to be able to entirely solve. But I don't think that's a good reason for us not to try. I'm happy to have Ground News in my toolkit, and there's a reason they're this channel's longest running sponsor. And so if you're interested, there will be a link in the description that'll give you access to a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use. And so with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so as is often the case, up front, I do need to throw up some caveats. As with last episode, this one's based on my visit to NATO's Shine event in Istanbul, so refer to that one if you want more detail. But as a reminder, while I was invited, I wasn't paid to be there, unless you count a coffee or two. And there was no editorial control beyond the obvious, like not recording people without their permission or revealing classified information. To support this segment, there are a number of people I interviewed, including representatives from some of the winning firms in the innovation challenges, and a number of Ukrainian and NATO officers in the colonel to major general range. I very deliberately made the decision to take those interviews off camera and on background only, so I can't use any of the recordings here, with the underlying logic there being that it gave everyone involved the freedom to speak just that bit more freely, without having to worry that every second word might become a potential gotcha on YouTube. As such, I need to stress that while those interviews were very useful and I got hours of audio out of them, what you're hearing today, just as last week, is ultimately just my opinion, based on my views and my perceptions of events, nothing more. Okay, so caveats in place. Before we move on to the tech, let's talk lessons learned. Because before you can know what you need to design and procure to be ready for a future war, you need at least an inkling of what a future war might look like. And historically speaking, one of the best ways to harvest those kind of ideas is in the wars that are being fought. For the Russian and Ukrainian forces that are actively fighting in Ukraine, in a lot of cases that learning process is going to be almost involuntary and Darwinian. Either you learn, or the opponent will continue painfully teaching you until you do. But what does that mean for countries that might be deeply interested in the lessons from a war, but which aren't actively fighting in it? Historically, we've seen countries come up with various answers to that problem, although for various reasons, most of them are probably non-starters in Ukraine, at least for the moment. For example, historically, one way to learn from a war that you're not fighting in is to go fight in it, at least a little bit, sort of. Countries might, for example, send a formation of volunteers, quote unquote, to fight alongside a friendly or allied state, providing them a mechanism to A, potentially support a friend or ally in a conflict without officially becoming a belligerent in the war, and B, give their military personnel a chance to go over there and gather experience and lessons from it. The experience of the German Condor Legion, for example, fighting in the Spanish Civil War, was critical to the development of German tactics and doctrine. And if you're looking for a more modern example, the North Koreans now openly acknowledge that they've sent thousands of troops to fight alongside the Russians against the Ukrainians. And for what I'm sure Pyongyang considers to be the relatively minor cost of getting a lot of those troops killed or wounded, being able to not just receive significant compensation from Russia, but also give the North Korean military, which hasn't fought a war since the 50s, a chance to gain some experience in modern conflict. A somewhat less risky historical option was to send military observers or attachés. These observers could essentially go spectate a war, gather observations and potential lessons, and convey them back to the sending country. In some cases, a nation would actually have attachés and observers on both sides of a conflict at the same time. British officers, officially and unofficially, would observe from both sides of the line during the US Civil War. And during the Russo-Japanese War, there was an absolute menagerie of international observers, embedded both with the Imperial Russian and Imperial Japanese forces. To illustrate, this somewhat interesting photo of Japanese General Tamamoto and his staff features a range of Western military attachés and war correspondents, the most senior of which you can see in the middle there, British General Sir Ian Hamilton. But in the context of the war in Ukraine, we haven't really seen this kind of phenomenon replicated on any appreciable scale for at least two reasons. The first is political and risk-based. Most, but not all, military personnel from NATO countries withdrawn from Ukraine shortly before or soon after the invasion in February 2022. There are still officers from NATO militaries in the country involved in tasks like monitoring weapons shipments, but not in the numbers or places you need if your primary goal was to try and harvest wartime lessons. There are various reasons for that decision, but two of the main ones are probably escalation management and risk. Because in order to get a proper understanding of what this war actually looks like, observing officers would presumably have to go fairly far forward, which brings with it greater and greater chances of being hit, becoming a casualty, with all the political and diplomatic fallout that might potentially follow if that happened. You can imagine decision makers looking at the risks of observers becoming prisoners, or some of the practical challenges involved in trying to get those observers into place without inhibiting Ukraine's operation or giving brigade commanders another issue to deal with, and deciding that, at least on that issue, the juice ain't worth the squeeze. Whatever the motives behind the decision, the reality is that NATO doesn't have a large-scale observer mission in Ukraine, which has meant that since 2022, it's largely had to make do with a variety of other methods. There were various bilateral relationships between various NATO countries and the Ukrainians, and there were analytic efforts being led by organisations like the Joint Analysis Lessons Learned Centre in Lisbon. You had exchanges of information between NATO and Ukraine and NATO member states in Ukraine. What the process was arguably missing, though, was two critical things: a central point for that NATO-Ukraine interaction, and Ukrainians. Less than a year ago, though, that model finally changed, with NATO establishing a small organisation called the Joint Analysis Training and Education Centre, or JATEC. Noting it does have to be said JATEC, not JATEC, because acronyms are mostly dished out on a first-come, first-served basis, and NATO already has its Joint Training and Evaluation Centre. Part of the idea behind the creation of JATEC was that NATO could create an organisation that would be responsible for identifying and help apply lessons from the war in Ukraine by actively involving the Ukrainians. Unlike your regular NATO organisations that won't employ non-member staff, JATEC has a permanent Ukrainian contingent and appears to work on the logic that if NATO can't go to Ukraine, then maybe Ukraine and its lessons can come to NATO, working out of the organisation's base in Bydgoszcz, Poland. Talking to those involved, there's a couple of ways that process can potentially work. Some things might be relatively simple and logistics-based, like setting up a joint secure computer system so the Ukrainians can provide data and lessons securely and easily. But some of what we've started to see happen is a bit more hands-on, particularly when it comes to getting Ukrainian officers more involved in NATO exercises and war games. In a recent pair of NATO naval exercises in Portugal, for example, the Ukrainians stepped in to play the red team, essentially trying to take on the role of the totally not Russians, partly to help make sure they acted as the Ukrainians have seen them act, rather than the way NATO might assume they would act, particularly when it came to things like the use of unmanned systems, which was a focus of Exercise Dynamic Messenger. I think that's arguably a promising start for this kind of process, but I imagine a number of analysts would be keen to see the Ukrainians integrated in a number of additional ways, particularly moving from the naval domain to exercises that are more land and air focused, and then taking on at least three key forms. Noting that some of this has already happened to at least some extent, but with significant room to potentially dial up the cooperation. Firstly, NATO on NATO exercises, where the Ukrainians take on a role in helping to design the exercise and adjudicate the results. All else being equal, that might help challenge any existing assumptions that are already in place, and perhaps help NATO move its exercises and war games out of the historical comfort zone and towards ones that might test and reflect some of that Ukrainian experience. As I said last time, for example, I found the NATO cross-domain command wargame to be really interesting to observe, but I do suspect the scenario for that wargame might have looked a bit different if there'd been greater Ukrainian involvement in designing and umpiring it. Secondly, I suspect we might also see more exercises where the Ukrainians take on the Op4 role as not Russia, bringing their experience with Russia's tactics, technology, and way of war to the table to make sure NATO is training against the Russian military as it exists in 2025, rather than the version that might have existed in the pre-2022 manuals and rulebooks. Finally, one thing I heard a couple of officers mention that they would really like to see are events where Ukrainian units, even relatively small Ukrainian units, are able to come to an exercise or a war game, bring all of their technology and tactics to the table, and test it head-on against equivalent NATO formations. Maybe that means getting a Ukrainian infantry company and letting them bring all of their organic assets, their Delta battle management system, their communications, their drones, and then for any assets they might realistically have but can't realistically bring, give them simulated or stand-in equivalents. If you want them to have artillery but can't bring their crews and guns, then give them a simulated equivalent or have an international force stand in for them. And then, once you have a useful setup, just run some company-on-company exercises. Let a Ukrainian infantry company with all of those drones go up against a NATO company without them, and just see what happens. Preferably without training restrictions or scenario assumptions that might prevent you learning lessons from that effort. For example, saying the Ukrainians can turn up but they can't fly their drones due to airspace restrictions, or just allowing the blue team to call in infinite air support and call it a day. The goal here wouldn't be competition. It would be learning and observing, trying to determine how many of these Ukrainian tools and tactics, which remember, in many cases the Russians are going to have access to as well, might actually perform against NATO forces as they currently stand, where the gaps are, and what things might or might not be immediate priorities for adoption. We've seen warnings from some NATO leaders against the danger of overlearning lessons from Ukraine. And to be fair, that's a risk with any war. And I'd suggest that one of the best ways to make sure that you're getting that balance right, learning and adapting what you should, but not what you shouldn't, is to test it. And one of the best ways to do that might be to invite the Ukrainians to the table, let them cook, and see what kind of lessons and technologies you might end up with. We haven't seen that kind of thing happening on a large scale yet, but with JATEC now established, I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the rest of 2025 and 2026. It's interesting to note that a number of the Ukrainians I've spoken to over time are quite keen on this idea, even though it would involve at least temporarily sending away valuable military units that are obviously desperately needed at home. Their general conviction was they genuinely believe they have something to teach their allies, and that they can take some valuable lessons in turn. And so from that point of view, the lessons, the experience, the alliance cohesion that might be gained through that kind of process is probably going to be worth the military inconvenience of giving up a couple of small units for a limited period of time. If lessons do come out of that kind of process, though, it won't be the end of the story. In most cases, to turn lessons into behaviour or capability, you're going to need to transform observations into doctrine, both at a NATO level and then also at a national one. So even if, to give a purely hypothetical example, the Ukrainians were to turn up to a NATO exercise tomorrow, murder everyone with FPVs, leading to a scenario conclusion that, yeah, those things are pretty dangerous, you might still expect a serious time delay before those small UAS lessons learned manage to find their way into NATO doctrine and practice. Given NATO isn't currently fighting Russia, when it comes to doctrine and training, that kind of delay might be considered acceptable. But when it comes to technology and systems that are meant to be deployed in Ukraine itself, the imperative is very much there to go significantly faster. Which brings us to the more technology-centric side of this event, which highlighted some of the ways that NATO and Ukraine have been working together to both help better equip Ukraine against some major Russian threats, while also training up and supporting parts of NATO's defence industrial base. Let me explain. Most of the military aid we've previously seen flow from allied states to Ukraine has been stuff they already have, either existing equipment and munitions that are pulled out of stockpile and transferred, or new production of existing designs. That works when NATO already has a good answer to whatever the Ukrainian requirement in question is. But in a conflict that's seen the kind of rapid adaptation that we've seen in Ukraine, that can't be taken as a given. And so what we've started to see play out this year, partly through the intervention of JATEC, is what's called the Innovation Challenge model. It's an approach that existed for years before Russia's 2022 invasion, functioning kind of as a NATO military hackathon, with the big change now being that Ukraine's been put in the driver's seat of setting the challenges. The basic idea here is the Ukrainians don't come forward with a request for specific equipment, they come forward with a particular technical problem. NATO then works up basically a challenge statement to industry saying, hey guys, here's the problems the Ukrainians are facing. And then there's a competition for industry to come forward with its best potential solutions to that problem, whatever those might be. This is dramatically different from an ordinary procurement process because it doesn't start with a particular solution in mind. If, for an example, an ordinary procurement process might look at the enemy fielding better fighter aircraft and go to market saying, hey, we need you to build us an even better fighter, the challenge model would say, hey, those enemy fighters are causing us some issues. How would you deal with them? The idea is to get to the test phase on any potential solution very quickly, then move on to testing it in Ukraine itself, and then, if it turns out the process is onto a winner, getting the thing deployed at scale. In 2025, Ukraine pushed for 2 of these innovation challenges that were stood up in rapid succession. The first was the challenge of intercepting and dealing with Russian glide bombs, and to a lesser extent things like Shahed one-way attack drones, with the second, starting only a short while later, being the challenge of fiber-optic controlled FPVs. Using this kind of challenge model is always going to come with its own complexities. You need to consider how much information and data you want to release to the market to guide the best possible solutions, while at the same time balancing the risk that that information, that data, ultimately helps inform Russian actions about your potential pain points. You also need to balance how specific you make the requirement to make sure that most of the things that come forward are potentially workable and you're not wasting your time, but at the same time, not locking out potential creative solutions that might surprise you. In the case of the glide bomb challenge, for example, I think there were more than 100 plus solutions put forward by various firms that NATO then had to filter through. Compared to traditional research and development and procurement approaches, the model also relies on at least 2 critical ingredients. Firms being willing to take a risk and put their own capital on the table, because this isn't the kind of system that awards participation trophies, and if your solution doesn't win, there's a chance you end up with a product without a buyer. And secondly, you need the Ukrainians to serve as both a critical data source and a potential testing lab, but we'll come back to that a little bit more when we talk about the solutions themselves. The key point to make up front, though, is basically that while there might be a couple of things that need to go into this process in order to make it work, when it does work, the advantage is that compared to traditional procurements, it can potentially move very quickly. JATEC was probably established in February of this year. In March, the glide bomb challenge was stood up, and by June, some of the solutions were undergoing testing in Poland, with some live testing under battlefield conditions in Ukraine following shortly thereafter. That's roughly 3 months from challenge to testing, and about 7 from request to limited battlefield testing. Perhaps not as lightning fast as some Ukrainian drone projects, for example, where a development cycle of 3 months might not be unheard of. But by NATO standards, this is fast. This is Millennium Falcon doing the Kessel Run fast. And the idea essentially is to try and harness the best of 2 available worlds. You're trying to take the combined industrial capacity, engineering and scientific know-how that exists across the NATO economies and combine it with the innovation, speed and awareness of the Ukrainians. You get the Ukrainians to provide the experience, the requirement, the data and the testing environment that enables these things to move quickly, and you get NATO to provide access to the kind of firms that can potentially answer that need. So if that's the structure and the process, let's talk about what they came up with for those first 2 challenges. With the first one I want to talk about being the second one that went live, fiber-optic FPVs. And for each of these challenges, I want to follow the same basic structure. What was the threat? How are the Ukrainians currently dealing with it? How do those solutions potentially fall short? And what did the challenges come up with as potential countermeasures? And so for this first one, the challenge was probably relatively familiar to any of you who'd been following the war in Ukraine through 2025. A whole suite of drone designs that have turned up on the modern battlefield, rejecting wireless, and re-embracing the good old cable. And while the challenge was framed around these wire-guided small UAS in particular, you can think of the challenges stretching to any small UAS that you can't counter with electronic warfare. In the here and now, that might mean because it's a drone running a 50-kilometre cable back to an operator, but in the future, it might also mean small drones or loitering munitions that are capable of fully autonomous operation, that don't need an outside signal in order to be lethal. For a long time now, I've been warning about the risk that over time, soft kill mechanisms like jamming may become less and less reliable. You're still likely to need them as a force, lest your opponent be able to fall back on cheap and readily available radio-controlled systems, which they can use to completely trounce you. But I think it's fair to say the number of accessible precision weapons out there that just don't care about jamming has increased significantly over the last couple of years and is likely to continue doing so. That is the nature of the risk that fiber-optic FPVs represent, and it's why we got this challenge. So far, most of the solutions the Ukrainians and Russians have been able to come up with are at best thoroughly imperfect. We've seen greater and greater efforts sunk into passive defences, both of logistics routes, like the netting you can see here, and also of individual vehicles in the form of more and more spaced and anti-drone armour. Then on the active defence side, as we mentioned in the episode on Game Changers, you do have stuff like shotguns, but those are very much last-ditch defensive options with relatively short ranges, not particularly high reliability, and the risk that even if a soldier is able to successfully intercept an FPV, they might set off the warhead, and given the ranges involved, that might result in troops becoming casualties or vehicles becoming damaged anyway. Better than taking a direct hit? Probably, but also not ideal. The innovation challenge to deal with these things fielded a huge number of potential solutions, and ultimately they awarded a top 3, with different parts of the podium addressing different parts of the problem. Because really, from a technological perspective, I'd argue you can think of the challenge of defending against these things as really falling into 2 steps. First, you need to be able to detect, and then defeat. At the tactical level, the detection of small UAS, including FPVs, can be more of a problem than you might expect. You can potentially see them with the Mark I eyeball, but these things can be very quick, not particularly large, and of course, many of them can operate at night, which does tend to complicate eyeball-based detection. Even if you can spot them the old-fashioned way, there's a challenge of what distance you're able to do that at and how many targets you can track at the same time. Sound-based detection is also possible, but battlefields can be noisy places, there can be a lot of drones flying about, and in a lot of cases, while the sound might alert a driver or an infantryman to the fact a drone is there, it might not provide a precise enough fix to get a weapon on target in the couple of seconds you might have before that detection becomes an impact. And so before even worrying about the challenge of shooting these things down, the challenge winner instead honed in on that issue of detection and tracking. What the US firm KMB basically came up with was essentially a counter-drone radar system. The system is reportedly capable of detecting even small Class 1 UAS at useful ranges, whether they're moving or not, can track multiple targets, operate from a moving vehicle, and critically, is built out of a bunch of commercial off-the-shelf components. So hopefully your costs stay low, scalability becomes easier, and you can potentially find ways to leverage software rather than hardware to solve some of your detection and tracking problems. The idea is that you could potentially mount these things on vehicles or UGVs or in fixed positions, and they would then be able to provide you detection, warning, and tracking at ranges well beyond what a soldier riding shotgun might be able to manage, especially in conditions where visibility might be lower. I keep coming back to that point around visibility because in Ukraine, as a matter of survival, a lot of logistics activity in particular has to happen at night. That protects troops and vehicles against detection and engagement by a lot of regular threats, but also limits their ability to defend themselves. The idea is that affordable, mass deployable radar might provide one solution to that particular problem. While radar might be able to tell you there's a drone threat there, however, that still leaves you with the problem of dealing with it, which is where the competition's second and third place winners come in. A theme that came up when I was talking to some of those involved in the challenge is that when it came to actually defeating FPVs and related threats like loitering munitions, most of the submissions defaulted back to kinetic defeat options, which is a fancy way of saying you just have to shoot the drones down. You can't really jam them, hide from them, or outsmart them, so you just have to fall back on the modern equivalent of throwing a rock at the thing until it stops moving. Some of the submissions put forward to potentially do that were interesting. One company, for example, submitted a 5-barrel rotary shotgun system capable of firing 3,000 shells a minute. Think basically a micro shotgun Seawits. Another didn't propose a specific weapon system per se, so much as a specialized type of ammo. Think basically a 12-gauge projectile utilizing Kevlar tethers optimized for drone engagements at around the 100 to 120 meter mark. I believe that one's already been tested in combat, and we probably haven't seen the last of these kind of specialized anti-drone shotgun loads. But ultimately, the remaining 2 podium places went to 2 relatively similar systems. They were both remote weapon stations that used standard caliber machine guns paired with sensors and an AI control system. One was a US design system, which I've seen tested in vehicle mounts, and the other one was from a Ukrainian firm. This one, from Ukrainian firm DONS, I think deserves a particular mention because it illustrates a wider trend. While these 2 challenges were, in a sense, put forward by the Ukrainians to try and seek answers to their problems from the NATO defense sector, perhaps because of the experience they have, a lot of the entries ended up being from Ukrainian firms. I think for the FPV competition, Ukrainian firms made up about a quarter of all the entries, and obviously at 1 out of 3, they made up a third of the podium finishes. This is also far from the first product from the firm in question, with some of their previous experience being in the area of armed UGVs, which obviously has a lot of crossover with what they're trying to do here. What the Ukrainian firm DONS showed off was essentially a small, lightweight remote weapon station equipped with a variety of sensors, including thermal, that was capable of, with operator permission, autonomously detecting and engaging FPVs. They were able to show a lot of footage of these systems in use, which unfortunately I can't share here, at least just yet, but they did show off plenty of video of this style of system operating from a range of different mounts. Static installations, ground vehicles, USVs, so naval operation, and of course, given their background, UGVs. From memory, the version they showed off was key to operate either with 7.62 or 5.56mm machine guns, but they were working on a 50 cal version as well. One idea that came through here was that in an ideal world, you'd probably combine both of these main solution types together. You'd want the radar in a convoy of vehicles or a defensive position to detect the drones initially and tell the guns where to point, and from there, the combination of the sensors on that remote weapon station and that radar working together could give you the information you need to get that gun pointed and that drone neutralized, hopefully before it can hit its target. Is that going to work with 100% reliability or against swarms of drones? Probably not. Is it probably going to be more expensive than just sticking a bloke in the back of a ute with a shotgun? Almost certainly. But NATO also seems to be betting that this is one of the most promising solutions we've found so far to the challenge of defending against jam-proof or jam-resistant FPVs and loitering munitions. And given just how dangerous and omnipresent those things have become, that matters. I also think it's fairly telling that at the same time, some elements of the US military appear to be gravitating towards similar solutions. Over in the States, we've seen some procurement of the Bullfrog remote weapon station, which is a similar concept. Remote weapon station with sensors, a standard caliber machine gun, and the capacity for autonomy. Because I think the reality has dawned on most users that against targets this small and this quick, you're just not going to get the precision you need if you're relying on the ability of a human to control these things with a joystick or control station while bouncing around in the back of a Humvee. And what I suspect is that as we see more of these systems tested and we get more user feedback and engagement data, that we see the designs and their capabilities continue to evolve. Better sensor fusion, more reliable autonomous targeting, and that eventually we see militaries and the market start to have a better idea of what kind of systems you really need and how you might potentially integrate different ones into your force. You might potentially see, for example, these relatively cheap rifle caliber systems becoming fairly standard defensive options on logistics vehicles, for example, if they're expected to operate in areas of high drone threat, which in Ukraine is basically anywhere even vaguely close to the front. But then you also have more expensive, heavier and higher performing systems that might use things like larger calibers, specialized ammo and better sensors to potentially give you greater effect and more range at the potential cost of weight and cost. It can seem like the overall trend here between what we're seeing in the war, events like this one, and fora like DSEI, is that many militaries and designers appear to increasingly be looking at having at least some kind of remote weapon station with CUAS capability as essentially a default pick. It may not be clear yet where preferences and dividing lines will be between rifle caliber and larger caliber systems, and what vehicles may or may not get either. But I suspect that on the drone-infested battlefield of the future, we're going to see less of Damo ripping away with a pintle-mounted machine gun, and increasingly more robo-guns blasting away at their autonomous drone kin. In the meantime, a lot of forces out there will likely start making guesses as to what exact types of systems, calibers, and installations make the most sense, while the Ukrainians will likely continue hitting the all-of-the-above button wherever they can because they can't afford to guess. And some of that same logic, the need to find an economical and widely deployable defensive answer to a new threat, also applies to the other innovation challenge, which looks specifically at glide bombs, although realistically also dealt with the challenge of Shahed-style one-way attack drones as well. We've talked a lot about Shaheds and glide bombs before, so I won't reintroduce the basic concept here, but I do think it's worth discussing quickly why they specifically got an innovation challenge, while some of Russia's more capable long-range weapon systems didn't. I'd argue, for example, something like Russia's Iskander TBM or its Caliber cruise missile is on average going to be much more dangerous than an individual glide bomb or an individual Shahed. The difference is that while they represent significant defensive challenges, they're ones with generally understood solutions. Russia's cruise and its ballistic missiles in particular are multi-million-dollar weapons with limited production volumes. That makes them suitable targets for interceptions by things like F-16s firing air-to-air missiles in the case of cruise missile threats, or Patriot PAC-3 interceptors or SAP-T in the case of Iskander and other ballistic threats. Essentially, the challenge isn't knowing how to countering them, it's just getting access to enough of the relevant countermeasures. Enough Patriots, enough SAP-Ts, enough AMRAAMs. But at the other end of the complexity spectrum, glide bombs still arguably represent a significant challenge for interception while being cheap enough and available enough to not represent economically viable targets for advanced SAM systems. Compared to something like a Shahed-style one-way attack drone, which the Ukrainians have a couple of existing countermeasures to, there are a few factors that might make glide bombs particularly annoying and challenging as targets. At least in their unpowered versions, you'd expect them to have a much more limited thermal and acoustic signature. There's no motor belting out angry lawnmower noises, they're just gliding. They're also often going to be travelling comparatively quickly, while also being relatively rugged. And so while the relatively lightweight structure of a Shahed-style drone might be pretty vulnerable to even a relatively small fragmentation warhead, in some cases it might take a bit more kick or a closer detonation in order to knock down a glide bomb. Now, there are compensating factors compared to either Shaheds or cruise missiles, particularly when it comes to factors like range and maneuverability. But at its core, it's that combination of cost efficiency, availability, with the difficulty of detection and interception that makes these things more of a technical problem than just an economic one. It's probably not enough to counter them by churning out more of the existing answers. You'd ideally want something new. Ukraine has come up with their own countermeasures, especially to the Shaheds, but none of them are perfect. Mobile fire groups, for example, which might be as simple as a couple of blokes in the back of a ute with a heavy machine gun, might be a cheap option against low-flying drone threats, but realistically, they're not going to be able to hit glide bombs, they're not going to be able to hit higher-flying drones, nor are you going to be able to use them safely right up against the forward edge of the battle area, where glide bombs might see a lot of use to attack Ukrainian defensive positions. Another emerging countermeasure, arguably the most important, has been the interceptor drone. And those are certainly achieving some very impressive results, and we're seeing more and more of them deployed over time. But I'd argue that to an extent, the observed successes we're seeing conceal some of the current limitations of the technology. Hitting something like a Shahed or a Gerber decoy with an interceptor drone is no easy feat. Increasingly, some of these Russian systems are equipped with rear-facing cameras and sensors that can detect an incoming interceptor and take evasive maneuvers to make the intercept more difficult. And if you're talking about a head-on intercept, a pilot's going to have to deal with a closing speed measured in the hundreds of kilometers per hour. A lot of these interceptions are going to happen at night when visibility is relatively limited, and all of these problems in terms of detectability, visibility, closing velocity all become even higher when you're talking about glide bombs close to the front. Essentially what I'm arguing is that part of the reason we're seeing interceptors achieve the results they are in Ukraine is not because the underlying technology is incredible. It's because Ukraine is able to cover up a lot of those technological limitations by just having really, really good pilots. Remember, some of these operators have been flying almost continuously for years at this point. The pool of operators is so large, you're always going to have some positive outliers. And so by now, some of the operators on both sides are just freakishly good. And so if you have a pool of operators who are good enough to pull the drone warfare equivalent of a 360 no-scope, then almost inevitably, you're going to get a bunch of intercepts, even against very difficult targets in suboptimal conditions. What it felt like the innovation challenge was looking for then were more idiot-proof solutions. Presumably, that would mean introducing a bit more automation to the process, which would have a few key drivers behind it. Better accuracy and performance, more scalability, usability against fast-moving targets like glide bombs, not just one-way attack drones, resilience against potential Russian countermeasures, like making them even more difficult targets or adding jammers that might cause interceptor pilots to lose connection as they approached, and, as an additional not-so-secondary benefit, also making these systems potentially more usable for forces other than Ukraine and Russia, with their large pools of experienced drone operators. The European NATO states, for example, are fairly long on airspace that needs to be defended against potential drone threats, while also being comparatively short on people who've spent the bulk of the last couple of years viewing the world through an FPV visor. In an emergency, you might be able to get somewhere by raiding the likes of drone racing teams or the people who do drone photography, but if mobilising the folks who do the drone shots for movies is your wartime air defence plan, you probably want a new one. So that's the basic challenge and some context behind it. What did the firms come up with? The winning entry, and the one I'm least comfortable talking about a bunch on YouTube, was an entry from a French firm, which, just as in the FPV category, was focused on detection and tracking, not necessarily the engagement phase. To avoid saying anything I shouldn't hear, I'm going to quote directly from the winning announcement. Quote, "The winning team, Alta Aeris, produced an artificial intelligence-enabled solution to counter glide bomb threats through early detection, rapid identification, and decision support. Originally developed for ISR missions in Ukraine, the system uses proprietary computer vision and machine learning algorithms to analyze visual and acoustic data and other tools in identifying real-time threats. It supports two key warfighting functions: alerting troops in target zones early enough to take cover or deploy jamming systems, and enabling preemptive strikes based on AI analysis of adversary targets." End quote. So basically, through the application of a little technical magic, you integrate this into your system, and it might help you do a couple of things. See the glide bombs, understand where they're going, which, as the announcement hints, might be enough to give the troops involved time to take cover and reduce the odds of a damaging impact, and also potentially go on a bit of offense as well. Presumably, you're also going to need something in your toolkit which can potentially intercept the things, preferably other than the intended target. Which brings us to entries 2 and 3 on the list, with the first focusing on a category system that we've already started to see evolve in Ukraine independent of this innovation process, which is taking the basic concept of an interceptor drone and then dialing up the automation level, integrating greater autonomy to try and take some pressure off the human operator. German firm Titan, which took second place in the competition, is one we've seen test interceptors in Ukraine before. They essentially put forward an iteration on the existing interceptor drone concept, with the kind of performance and autonomy you might need to realistically be able to intercept harder targets like glide bombs. As an aside, I'll also note that one potential side effect of this march towards greater and greater autonomy in interceptors is that you might see drone pilots capable of controlling systems of more than one interceptor at the same time, in a sense converting a drone pilot into a drone air defense system operator, which might potentially be very useful in the case of larger attacks or in the case of organisations like mobile fire groups that might not have a massive headcount. And while it might not be perfect, because you're talking about a partly 3D printed interceptor drone here, it might potentially make intercepting things like glide bombs possible without being economically oppressive. Like several other drone producers, Titan has also showed off a launcher arrangement which might give users a bit more flexibility in how they set up their air defense network. The basic idea here is that you can have essentially launch boxes, if you will, that you might either be carting around on the back of a vehicle or setting up in the path of potential threats, giving you the ability to potentially cover more ground than a system that's reliant on the operator to, for example, hand launch the interceptor. If you think of the 3 winners of the competition as a system, this is the outer, more active layer, if you like, an iteration on some of the things we've already seen Ukraine do, but specifically adapted to that glide bomb threat. Concept 3, however, is a little bit less tested and something a bit different. The easiest way to describe what the firm here, another French one in this case, came up with is basically aerial drone minefield. The basic idea here is that you'd have portable modular container systems that can carry and launch lots and lots of drones, and you'd position those either in a perimeter around strategic objects like a power plant or at the extreme even a city, or potentially in the path of expected threats. On command, the system would then launch essentially a swarm of small drones which would form pretty much a literal wall in the air. They would then be networked together with potentially multiple types of drones being used. You could have a more expensive control drone mounting a bunch of expensive sensors and compute, for example, along with the much cheaper drone landmines, or air mines in this case. They would then wait for a potential threat, be that a cruise missile, a Shahed, or a glide bomb to fly through the wall, trigger the proximity sensors on one or more of the interceptors, set off the warheads, and hopefully bring down the threat. Based on what kind of threat you expected the wall to deal with, you could also customize the way it operated. You could change out the warhead depending on the intended target, while also potentially altering the geometry of the defensive wall itself. Against something relatively maneuverable but comparatively slow and fragile like a Shahed, for example, you might want to accept more space between interceptors in order to create a wider wall. That way it might be less practical for the Shahed to try and essentially maneuver around the defensive barrier. Meanwhile, against something like a glide bomb, which is less maneuverable but going to be moving a lot faster and is also tougher, seeing as it's mostly just a dumb bomb with a guidance kit, you might want your drones to pack much closer together to make sure that when a drone goes off, it's likely to be closer to the glide bomb when it detonates, and then position your drones in multiple layers for a degree of redundancy. Speaking to representatives from the company, they seem pretty confident that that process of altering the geometry and responding to threats can be pretty much autonomous. Meaning the presumed goal here would be to get to a point where a relatively small number of human operators can control a very large number of interceptors and cover a significant amount of territory. In part because we were in Istanbul while doing this, the demonstration I saw included relatively few drones and basically just served as a proof of concept. But the ambition is clearly to operate lots and lots of these things at the same time, getting around the challenge of actually having to physically intercept an object by just creating a wall in its path and then relying on proximity detonation, and potentially using the mass and affordability of the system to create an almost persistent barrier. The way that would work is that you'd have one flight of drones up, forming a wall or multiple walls at the same time. As they began to run low on battery, they would self-recover back into their charging units, and a second flight of drones would be launched to take their place. As long as the interceptors don't actually have to intercept anything and explode in the process, they should be recoverable and reusable. So during high threat periods, if you had enough launchers, drones, and charging systems, it might potentially be possible to keep a defensive grid up for hours or even days at a time, basically acting as mobile nets, if you like, to try and catch threats that made it through the other layers of the air defense system. Now, to be honest, there's a lot more to say about this system, how it potentially operates, its potential implications, etc. But for the moment, I think that's about where I'm comfortable leaving the discussion on YouTube. It's a very different approach to drone-based air defence, in some ways closer to the barrage balloons of World War I and II than it is to an interceptor missile, and normally I'd just say that time would tell how a concept like this might perform under actual battlefield conditions against real threats like Shaheds and glide bombs. But in this case, it might not be that much time. After all, the process here focuses on getting good concepts to the testing phase and utilisation in Ukraine as fast as possible. So instead of theory crafting how a system like this is likely to perform, we can instead just wait for the actual results, albeit with a slight delay for those results to become public, and an asterisk that as the system and the threat evolves, performance might obviously change. I'd argue the point isn't so much whether or not any of these systems will revolutionise the air war or how they perform. We'll find that out in due time. It's more that in most cases, these represent concepts that have gone from corporate pitch to field testing in significantly less than a year. And that kind of speed potentially raises the odds that Ukraine will get workable technical solutions to the problems they identify fast enough for it to really matter. And while the FPV and glide bomb challenges are still playing out, a third one's already been announced. The next challenge is going to address a major problem faced by both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries, which is casualty evacuation relatively close to the front line, where drones and other threats make any movement extremely difficult. Basically, partly because drones have gotten so good, resupplying the front line has become very dangerous, rotating forces has become extraordinarily dangerous, and options for getting soldiers who are wounded back to the rear are in many cases severely limited. I could provide some Russian sources that anecdotally claim, for example, that on some parts of the front, the ratio between Russian killed in action and wounded in action is now only about 1-to-1, in part because in some places Ukrainian drone operators just make it so difficult to move that in a lot of cases casualty evacuation just doesn't happen, and being wounded has become a bit of a you're on your own kid situation. As one officer I spoke to put it, the golden hour for casualty evacuation is now gone, and it might now be the golden day or the golden never. And as those Russian figures might suggest, not being able to get wounded to a surgical team quickly can have potentially horrific implications for survivability. Between 2001 and 2018, the United States managed to get the fatality rate for its casualties in Afghanistan down from around 20% to less than 9%, with that improvement and the very wide wounded-to-killed ratio being credited to a range of improvements in interventions. Quote, better measures to control bleeding, more rapid blood loss replacement, and reducing the time from injury to reaching a field hospital to 60 minutes or less, known as the golden hour. It was pretty clear evidence, if any was needed, that getting the wounded evacuated quickly matters. But what do you do when the helicopters can't reach the front line? When logistics vehicles have to sneak around, mostly at night? And a lot of resupply and rotation has to be done at night, on foot, and over long distances. Something that might not be workable, especially for the severely wounded. So far, we've seen the Ukrainians try a couple of things, using UGVs for casualty evacuation, or pushing surgical teams further forward so the wounded don't have to be pulled back as far. But none of those options are anywhere near being perfect or a complete solution to the problem. So what answers will the Innovation Challenge come up with to potentially address that issue? We don't know yet. But if by chance you think you have an answer to the challenges of medical care in a transparent and contested battle space, you can submit your abstract by November 17th and get ready to pitch in London in December. And I think that's a useful segue into some final observations about this Innovation Challenge model and some of the technologies we're seeing it bring forward. The way I've generally seen this described is as a form of NATO-facilitated assistance to Ukraine. In a way that makes sense because it's Ukraine in the driver's seat for developing these requirements, and it's likely to be them that first deploys any of these technologies in action. But I actually think there's a strong case to be made that there's a lot of benefits here flowing back in the other direction. Yes, Ukraine is driving the process, but in many ways, they're also the ones enabling it. Without Ukraine providing the insights into what Russia is doing or likely to do, there'd be a lot more guesswork involved in generating those requirements. Without access to Ukrainian data, it might be a lot harder to develop these systems, especially those with significant AI features. And then, without Ukraine to function essentially as a live testing ground for these ideas against actual Russian systems, it would be significantly harder to demonstrate and prove how any of these technologies or systems are actually likely to perform under combat conditions. Basically, the Ukrainians need the development process here to be a speed run, but they're also the reason that's possible. And there's nothing to stop the participating firms and the relevant governments becoming major beneficiaries of that process. If European nations are looking to re-equip and rebuild their militaries, the insights to guide that process and understand what to procure first have to come from somewhere. If they want what's come to be described in public as a drone wall to potentially deal with Russian long-range drone threats, then everything that has to go into that system, from the sensors to the networking to the interceptors themselves, is going to have to be based on something and come from somewhere. And I'd argue the Innovation Challenge model arguably represents a relatively low-cost way, for NATO states to help meet some of Ukraine's immediate requirements, while also potentially setting up solutions for themselves as well, with Ukraine playing a critical role in de-risking and proving out some of those technologies. Which brings us to some closing observations on this process as a whole. How Ukraine and NATO are cooperating on questions like lessons learned and technology development, where things have already significantly changed since February 2022, and where there still might be imperatives to change more. On the tech side, given the pace of the adaptation-counter-adaptation cycle in Ukraine, some of the people I spoke to were also very aware of the risk that this kind of challenge-based model risked becoming overly reactive. Basically the danger that even if you could develop a technology or product quickly, if you always waited for Russia to develop and field something and for it to become a problem before you stood up a challenge like this, in a sense, you'd always risk being behind, even if it was for less time than before. And while you were developing a solution to Russian system or technology A, they might be waiting to roll out system or technology B the moment your countermeasure hit the field. What that suggests, I'd argue, is there might be space when issuing these kind of challenges is that you don't just consider the risk and urgency of technologies and systems the Russians are currently fielding, but also the stuff that they might field. An example here might be something like true drone swarm technology. At the moment, it's not really a reality on the Ukrainian battlefield in a significant way. We know a lot of countries and companies out there are actively working on it. It's probably going to surface eventually, so it might make sense to start thinking about potential countermeasures now, rather than waiting for that first rude awakening. I'd also suggest there might be room to use this kind of model in a more preemptive way. Basically, don't focus just on creating countermeasures to things your opponent has that are causing you problems. Also spend some time and effort on coming up with things that'll cause your opponent problems. A lot of the innovation challenges we've seen so far, even before Ukraine started to get involved in this way, were primarily defensive. To give some examples, in 2018, it was countering UAS in an urban area. In 2019, preventing and recovering from an EMP. 2021, space domain awareness and countering cognitive warfare. The alliance instinct here, if you will, appears to be to often focus on the defensive. And when I raised this point with some of the officials at the event, the response I often got was, yeah, we're a defensive alliance. But with that often came the acknowledgement that to be a defensive alliance, you need to be able to deter. And realistically, deterrence is often going to require a mix of offensive and defensive capabilities. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens if at any point the Ukrainians come forward with a brief for a potential innovation challenge that's less focused on solving their own problems and more on creating some new ones for the Russians. One major barrier here, of course, is the need for secrecy and a desire to not forewarn your opponent about a threat that might be coming, which might go some way towards explaining why the many offensive developments we've seen so far have come out of other processes. But I do think it might be interesting to watch what topics are selected for future innovation challenges going into 2026 and beyond. I also think the process highlights the difference in risk for the Russians and Ukrainians in developing and testing new systems, driven by the pressures of war. In a lot of cases, the Russians and Ukrainians are willing to take a bit of a fail-fast approach. They'll take an idea, like a new UGV design, or whatever that assault shed configuration you can see on the bottom right there is, and to figure out whether it's going to work or not, they'll basically use it and see what happens. Fast development and perfect products seldom go together. To make this process work, NATO is very deliberately adopting a bit more of a Ukrainian-style approach here, moving quickly, testing early, and taking risks. And it might be the case that there are other places in the NATO development ecosystem outside just these Ukraine-focused challenges where that kind of approach might be potentially useful. I do think it's clear, though, that the model being demonstrated here doesn't represent an entire or complete solution to NATO's innovation problems, in a sense because, at once, the alliance is in a way too big and too small. The sheer number of members means that while there might be some common NATO doctrinal documents, that doesn't mean that all the nations involved are on the same page when it comes to new and disruptive technology. For example, I basically asked a number of officers at the event from different countries what they thought the destiny of the tank would be on the future battlefield. And between them, they had some very different answers. Part of the reason the innovation challenge model can move so quickly is because while a lot of different countries can answer the requirement, one country is driving it, Ukraine. But when you flip the objective from getting something that Kyiv will use to something that multiple NATO states will use, you might be looking at considerably more time, more complexity, and political capital. In other technical respects, in some ways the NATO structure itself might be unduly limiting. Without going into too much detail, there were a couple of times at this event where I was presented with an observed technical problem, where my first thought was arguably that there was a company out there with a potential solution to that problem, they just weren't a part of NATO. From a NATO perspective, you obviously don't want to post an invitation to these things on Facebook and invite all comers, but I think there might be some benefit to inviting more participation from friendly and allied countries. Ukraine is obviously the proof of concept, but I think in the future, it might be interesting if we see more engagement from companies coming from the Republic of Korea or Japan, for example, places with significant defence industrial and scientific capacity, and in some cases, quite similar military problems. There are also other potentially valuable partners out there. It's taking a lot of discipline not to shill for Australian firms in this segment, for example, but hopefully you get the core point. There's a lot of expertise out there in different parts of the global defence sector, and while the alliance has already set its eyes on some of the expertise coming out of Ukraine, it'd be interesting to see them cast a wider net as well. Two broad closing observations then, having gone to this event, talked to some of the people involved, and gotten an understanding of where this process might be going. My impression was that a lot of these things, like JATEC linking Ukraine to the Innovation Challenge model, and also getting the Ukrainians more involved in NATO exercises, appear to be relatively practical and intuitive ways to try and get results quickly, and in the context of an organisation as bulky as NATO, that's always going to be an achievement. But getting to something that could move quickly clearly didn't happen quickly. JATEC was, after all, stood up in early 2025, not early 2023. And I suspect a major imperative going forward will be making sure that it's not just technology development and testing that moves quickly, it's organisational change as well. There are absolutely no signs that the pace of technology or innovation in Ukraine is slowing down, and in many respects, the risks of falling behind for other countries, including NATO states, may actually be increasing. I'd argue that provides plenty of strategic imperative to keep the process of innovation moving as quickly as possible. That doesn't always have to be directly related to Ukraine. NATO's Defence Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, for example, also sets innovation-style challenges and then provides support and accelerator services for companies that respond to those challenges without Ukraine directing or participating in the process in the same way they did with the recent innovation challenges. But the war is both a crucible for development and in some ways the canary in the technological coal mine. If new technologies, approaches, threats or opportunities are going to manifest, there's a decent chance that they show up there first. And so what we might expect to continue seeing going forward is many of Ukraine's allies looking to Kyiv, just as many of Russia's friends look to Moscow to get their early warning on when a new emerging disruptive technology or tactic is starting to show itself. But that recognition of a threat or a disruptive technology can really only be the start of the process. In some ways, that's the easy part. Because if the goal is to improve a force, whether that's Ukraine or the various NATO militaries, it's not enough just to observe and recognise a lesson, you have to apply it. You need to turn those hard-won Ukrainian observations into new tactics, new systems, new technology, new doctrine. This event demonstrated some of the ways it's possible for Ukraine and its allies to try and make that happen. But how things will play out as new systems head to the battlefield for testing and new lessons flow back in response, only time, albeit perhaps not too much time, will tell. And okay, channel update to close out. Firstly, one set of apologies and a major set of thanks. I am sorry this episode was delayed a bit, but I wanted to take the opportunity to get it right. And unfortunately, the combination of transit time and jet lag can sometimes make that difficult to do in a timely manner. Short of some major disruptive event though, this should be the last major international travel of the year. So I'm hoping that once things normalise a bit and I get caught up, we should be back to a more regular release schedule, at least for a while. That said, I do want to extend a massive thanks to the people over at NATO's Allied Command Transformation for the invitation to this event, everyone who agreed to be interviewed on background for either this episode or the previous one, and for this episode in particular, special thanks both to the representatives for some of the winning firms in the Innovation Challenge and to all the people over at JATEC. I'm aware it's still a relatively small organisation with a lot on its to-do list, so I do appreciate them taking the time out to answer my many questions. The senior Ukrainian officer present was particularly generous with his time, covering both this and a range of other topics, and so once again to the whole team over there, thank you very much. This was the second of the 2 episodes I've now done on the event, and it's probably the last one I'm going to be releasing on YouTube, at least for now. But I do expect some of the other material I haven't used might surface in future episodes, or eventually go up on Patreon. On that note too, the Patreon subscribers who partly help facilitate all this, there will be a topic poll going up either by the time this one is released or within the next 24 hours. So if you'd like some input into the topics you're likely to see in the coming weeks, please do check that out. There are a few more things I could provide updates on, but I might save them for a time when my body clock's just a bit less inverted. So for the moment, let me just thank you all for your ongoing support and engagement. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you all again for the next one.